Most people think Grow a Garden is just another relaxing Roblox farming game. You plant seeds, you water them, you harvest them and sell the crops for money. Everything about the game feels peaceful and simple. Bright colors, happy music, and a calm little garden that slowly grows over time. But some players believe the game wasn't created randomly. They believe certain features in Grow a Garden were inspired by a real and disturbing story. A story about a man and a garden that grew things far too quickly. Years ago, in a quiet rural town somewhere in the northern United States, there lived a man named Arthur Bennett. Arthur wasn't very well known for talking to people. In fact, most neighbors barely ever saw him. He lived alone in an old wooden house that had been in his family for generations. By the time he inherited it, the place had already started falling apart. The paint on the house was peeling, the windows were dusty and cracked, the fence surrounding the property leaned sideways like it might collapse at any moment. But there was one thing on that property that looked strangely alive: Arthur's garden. The entire backyard was covered in plants. Rows and rows of crops stretched across the land behind his house: tomatoes, pumpkins, corn, sunflowers, and even plants that normally couldn't grow in that region. And yet somehow, everything grew perfectly. At first, people in the neighborhood just assumed Arthur was a very skilled gardener. Some even admired how healthy his crops looked. But over time, they started noticing something strange. Arthur's plants grew much faster than normal. A tomato plant that should take weeks to mature would already be fully grown within a few days. Pumpkins became enormous almost overnight. Corn stalks shot up from the soil faster than anyone had ever seen before. At first, it sounded like exaggeration, but the children in the neighborhood began telling strange stories. Some of them would climb onto the broken fence around Arthur's yard just to peek into the garden. What they claimed to see made the adults uncomfortable. One child said he watched a pumpkin slowly expand while he was staring at it. Another said the vines on the ground seemed to move slightly, like they were crawling across the soil. Of course, adults dismissed the stories. Kids imagine things all the time, but even the adults couldn't explain one thing: Arthur harvested crops almost every single day. Boxes of vegetables constantly appeared outside his house, way more than one person could possibly grow alone. Yet nobody ever saw him buying fertilizer. Nobody saw delivery trucks. Nobody saw him bringing in supplies. And the strangest part was that Arthur almost never left his property, except sometimes at night. Several neighbors later said that around 2 or 3 in the morning, they would see a faint light moving through Arthur's garden. It was his lantern. Arthur would walk slowly between the rows of plants, holding the lantern close to the ground. At first, people assumed he was simply checking on his crops, but one neighbor who lived across the road claimed something different. She said Arthur wasn't just walking through the garden, he was talking. At first, she thought he was talking to himself, but after listening carefully from her window, she realized something unsettling. Arthur was whispering into the soil, not loudly, just quiet murmurs, as if he was speaking to something underground. The woman later told police that one night she clearly heard Arthur say something that made her skin crawl. He said, "You're hungry again, aren't you?" And then he started digging. No one knows exactly how long Arthur lived like this, but one day everything suddenly stopped. Arthur Bennett disappeared completely. The lights inside his house stayed on for days. His lantern was still lying in the middle of the garden path, but Arthur himself was nowhere to be found. At first, neighbors assumed he had simply gone somewhere, but after nearly a week without seeing him, someone finally called the police. When investigators arrived, they immediately noticed something strange. The garden had grown completely out of control. Plants covered almost every inch of the backyard. Corn stalks towered higher than the roof of the house. Thick vines twisted across the ground like tangled ropes. Pumpkins sat half buried in the soil, each one the size of a small car. It looked less like a garden and more like a jungle. But what really disturbed the investigators was the soil. Despite the cold weather that week, the soil in the garden felt warm. Not hot, but noticeably warm, almost like something underneath it was producing heat. Then they found something else. Right in the center of the garden was a large patch of freshly disturbed earth. The dirt looked like it had been dug up recently, but not with a shovel. The hole wasn't neat. It looked messy, uneven, almost like something had clawed its way through the soil. At first, investigators thought Arthur might have buried something there, but when they checked deeper into the hole, they didn't find a body, they didn't find tools, they didn't find anything at all. Just loose dirt and a strange smell coming from deep in the ground. Police eventually sent several of the crops from Arthur's garden to a laboratory for testing. The results were strange. The edible vegetables themselves were perfectly edible, but their internal structure was unusual. Plant cells normally divide at a predictable rate. These ones had multiplied far faster than they should have, almost like the plants had been exposed to some unknown growth catalyst. Scientists couldn't explain it, but one laboratory technician later reported something even stranger. One of the tomato samples continued growing slightly, even after it had already been cut. Not by much, just a few millimeters, but plants aren't supposed to grow after they've been harvested. The Bennett case slowly disappeared from the news after that. Arthur Bennett was officially listed as a missing person. His house eventually rotted away and was demolished years later. The land was eventually sold, and for a long time, people stopped talking about the strange garden until the internet rediscovered the story. Old forum posts began sharing pieces of the case. People started calling it the Bennett Garden incident. Some believed Arthur discovered a new fertilizer. Others believed something darker. They believed Arthur had found something buried deep beneath his property, something that helped plants grow, something that fed the soil. Then, almost 20 years later, a small Roblox game appeared. The game was called Grow a Garden. At first glance, it looked completely harmless. Players plant seeds, they grow crops, they harvest vegetables and sell them for money. But some players began noticing odd similarities between the game's mechanics and the old Bennett Garden story. For example, in the game, plants grow extremely fast, sometimes much faster than they realistically should. Then there's the mutation system. Certain plants can randomly grow into strange, more valuable forms with unusual properties, different colors, different sizes, different shapes, which reminded some people of the strange laboratory reports about Arthur's crops. But the most unsettling similarity appears in another feature of the game, the pets. In Grow a Garden, players can obtain small creatures that help crops grow faster. Most players see them as cute companions, but if you look closely at some of them, they don't really resemble normal animals. Some of them look like strange creatures made of soil and plants, almost like something that might have crawled up from underground, just like the disturbed soil in the center of Arthur Bennett's garden. Over the past few years, players have occasionally posted strange stories online after playing the game for a long time. Most people assume these are just glitches, but the stories all describe something similar. Some players claim their crops continued growing even when the game was paused. Others say they saw vines slowly spread across their garden much faster than the normal animation should allow. One player even claimed while standing still in his garden, he saw a plant move slightly, even though nothing had triggered its animation. Of course, none of this has ever been proven, but there is one detail that appears in several of these stories. Players sometimes report hearing a faint whispering sound while standing in their garden. Very quiet, almost impossible to notice unless the music is turned off. And the strange part is that the sound doesn't seem to come from the environment. It sounds like it's coming from the soil itself, almost like someone or something is whispering from underneath the ground. Maybe Grow a Garden really is just a simple farming game, but if the old story about Arthur Bennett is true, then maybe the developers didn't invent everything in that game. Maybe they simply recreated parts of something that actually happened. And if that's the case, then the most unsettling part of the story isn't the plants that grow too fast. It isn't the strange mutations. It isn't even the creatures that appear in the garden. It's the hole that investigators found in the center of Arthur Bennett's property. Because that hole wasn't empty. It was a tunnel, and whatever made it was never found.